thank you all for joining us this evening for this first in a type of program that Reflections of Manatee has ever hosted. And I really want to thank you for joining us and becoming part of that. I am Sherry Robinson-Svekis, and I am the president of Reflections of Manatee. I've been a member of their board for the last 15 years now. Reflections was founded in 1997 to conserve historical, archaeological, and natural resources surrounding and including the Manatee Mineral Spring. With grit, determination, and thousands upon thousands of volunteer hours, this tiny organization succeeded in protecting the spring from development and rescuing and restoring 3 historic houses, which are now listed on the National Register of Historical Places and repurposed as a museum complex. Because Reflections successfully preserved the spring, they were able to assist and help fund archaeologists to locate evidence of Angola and lead its nomination as a site on the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Our exhibit center currently includes interpretation about the early Manatee settlement, the Archaeology of Freedom exhibit about the excavations for Angola, and finding the belongings of freedom seekers, and an exhibit on Florida's maroon communities, their alliances, their soldiers, their flights to freedom. When Reflections was founded, the stories it told were about white settlement of the Florida frontier. The excavations for Angola has not only changed the known history of Manatee, but also changed the trajectory of our organization. Our mission, which was once looking back to preserve and celebrate a single period of time, is now one of engagement and inspiration to help people understand the diversity of the past and the hard truths that it holds, and to use that knowledge to build a better future for our community. This conversation is actually a kickoff of this new mission. So funding for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities Council with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Facts are facts, but any conclusions or opinions expressed by myself or our panelists do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. That is the boilerplate statement. I added the facts are facts in the middle of it that we are required under our grant funding to announce that if we say something, don't blame them. But my opinion is that Florida Humanities Council is a force for good in this state, and their support allows organizations such as ours to leverage our passion with real dollars to fund programs that help our broader communities. So with that, I am going to get on to the introduction of our panelists and the discussion that you've all really come to hear today. Let's see, fourth to my right. Dr. Julie Armstrong is a professor at the University of South Florida. She is a civil rights and Southern literature scholar. Her research interests include literary engagements with segregation, the civil rights movement, and other social justice issues. Dr. Armstrong has been the recipient of the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Research and Creative Activity at USF's St. Petersburg campus. Dr. Armstrong worked on the creation and installation of a lynching memorial in St. Petersburg, locating where an actual lynching occurred. Sitting next to Dr. Armstrong is Jacqueline Hubbard, who is president of the St. Petersburg branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Ms. Hubbard is a retired attorney. She was the first co-chair of the Pinellas County Lynching Memorial Community Coalition from 2019 to 2021, now called Pinellas Remembers. Ms. Hubbard is also co-chair of the Pinellas County Community Remembrance Project Coalition, with its mission to bear witness to the legacy of racial terror epitomized by lynchings in America. It was this coalition that erected the Equal Justice Initiative lynching memorial marker in February 2019 that was located where that actual lynching occurred. Next on the table, we have Lewis Parker. Mr. Parker is the co-founder and CEO of the Visible Men's Academy here in Bradenton. Mr. Parker left a highly successful career as a corporate leader to attack the humanitarian crisis of education for boys of color by opening a K-5 free public school for boys, Visible Men's Academy, in the heart of the high poverty area of Bradenton. Mr. Parker grew up in Pittsburgh in one of the 10 worst neighborhoods in the country, according to a Rachel Maddow report in 2011. Despite growing up in poverty, like the boys at Visible Men Academy, Mr. Parker was able to attend Phillips Academy, Andover, University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard Business School. And at the end of the table here, we have the Reverend James Golden, who is a longtime resident of Bradenton and former pastor at Bradenton's Ward Temple African Methodist Episcopal Church. Reverend Golden is a veteran, a member of the Florida Bar, and holds a Master of Divinity degree. Reverend Golden has served multiple terms on the Bradenton City Council and is currently the chairman of the Manatee County School Board. We are so honored that these people were giving of their time to come and participate in this conversation this evening. Now, moderating the discussion at the far table, Renee Gilmore from ABC 7 Sarasota. A fourth-generation Sarasotan, Ms. Gilmore began her career as a journalist at ABC 7, she says, when the station was surrounded by cow pastures and vegetable fields. She transitioned from broadcasting to leading national multi-billion-dollar business initiatives after earning an MBA at Clark Atlanta University. Her achievements in capacity building, innovative programming, and changing the organizational culture has won accolades from both the U.S. Department of Labor and the White House. After 25 years of private sector and government projects, Ms. Gilmore founded a small consulting firm to guide micro-businesses through strategic planning. She is executive producer and host of ABC 7's Empowering Voices, exploring diversity and inclusion and issues of interest to communities of people who are underrepresented, marginalized, and whose concerns are nearly invisible to privileged Americans. Last but not least, we have Dr. Uzi Baram, professor of anthropology at New College of Florida, director of the New College Public Archaeology Lab. Dr. Baram's research and teaching focuses on race and ethnicity, colonialism, and the intersections of archaeology and heritage. Dr. Baram was the lead archaeologist on the Looking for Angola project, as well as numerous other heritage research projects in Sarasota and Manatee counties. A hallmark of his work is his commitment to community engagement, a highlight of which was working with the Woodlawn Galilee Cemetery Restoration Task Force to document every one of the extant 1,544 grave markers in the historically Black Galilee Cemetery. So as people get seated, I'm going to turn it over to our moderators. And again, thank you all for coming. And now this place is going to liven up that I'm done talking, and we can turn it over to people who really know what they're saying and have something to say. Go for it, Uzi.
Sherry, as always, overly modest after having ensured so much good has occurred throughout these communities. Welcome to you all. Good evening. Our future is in our past. In the 1970s, there was a poster that I had in my room from Israel that laid out that simple statement. Our future is in our past. In my office at New College of Florida, I have probably almost a shelf of books that state in one way or another, history matters. And there's sort of an acceleration, particularly among anthropologists, to kind of insist on that history matters. But we're here tonight not to argue that history matters, but to ask how it matters. And how does it matter for for issues of race and social justice, particularly here in Manatee County. I've been living in this region for a quarter of a century, and I've heard the stories about the history for this region. And there's sort of a standard history that I was given, and I think still gets reproduced, that this was a land of Native Americans, and that's usually given a few sentences, a few paragraphs, even though it encompasses tens of thousands of years of history. Hernando de Soto leads an expedition with 110 ships, 700 men, some horses and dogs, and a couple of women in 1539, and explores the greater, what's now the greater U.S. Southeast. In 1842, Josiah Gates, his wife, 2 children, his brother-in-law, and 8 enslaved people come to the Manatee Mineral Spring. They're joined by others. They create the village of Manatee, and that starts to grow. In 1855, Florida creates the county of Manatee, and during the Civil War, Union troops land after blowing up the sugar works at the Gamble Plantation. And then the city continues to grow and grow. And ultimately, the town of Manatee joins up with the city of Bradenton. By the mid-20th century, the local residents start writing histories. So books with titles like The Lures of Manatee or The Singing River tell us about some of those pioneers, their children and grandchildren, and some of the events. It's actually a nice, straightforward story. Archaeologically, we actually see there's a lot more going on. We start by thinking about what actually was happening here. And archaeologically, those thousands of years of indigenous history are complicated. There are societies that rise and fall. There are polities that come about, and individuals making all sorts of decisions. The Spanish expedition failed, and we actually know very little of what was occurring in this region from the 1500s until the 1770s. In the 1770s, from Havana came fisher folk, and they came to fish the waters of Sarasota, Charlotte Harbor, Sarasota Bay, Tampa Bay, and so forth. They started with seasonal camps, both drying and salting fish for the Havana market, particularly for Lent. And they seem to have interacted with both Seminole, who were in the interior, and Maroons, who started congregating by the Manatee Mineral Spring. That series, those people, those Maroons, we know of today as Angola. In 1821, a slave raid came down the coast and destroyed that community. Hundreds were captured. Others escaped to the interior. Others escaped via the Everglades to Cape Florida and on to the British Bahamas, where their descendants have lived in freedom to this day on Andros Island. And others stayed in the region, finding places where they wouldn't be captured. Then came those Anglo-American pioneers, and a place that had been of freedom became a place of enslavement. Those Union troops were black troops, and we have just so much more that was going on. As Sherry pointed out, Reflections of Manatee started in 1997 because a couple knew that a lot of history occurred by that spring, and they thought it was important to preserve it. They knew the history that was on the signpost about Josiah Gates and the village of Manatee, but they were really good stewards of that land. And when Vicki Oldham created Looking for Angola back in 2004, Trudy and Jeff Williams were just such gracious hosts, not just allowing us to excavate on the property, but since I didn't think about food, brought peanut butter sandwiches and lemonade for my students so they wouldn't get too hungry. I just always forget to feed people when I'm doing these projects. We were able, through that work, to recover a community of freedom-seeking people that the National Park Service has placed on the Network to Freedom, to recognize as part of the Underground Railroad. The project was successful because we never had it as just an academic endeavor. That from the beginning, it was about outreach in any way we could. We started the program in January 2005 with a kickoff event and then a dozen discussions. We invited the media and volunteers every time I took out a shovel and put it into the ground. What used to be called Newspapers and Education by the New York Times created not one, not two, not three, not four, but 4 tabloids to give to school children in Manatee and Sarasota County. WEDU showed a video, the documentary that Vicki Older made. Students took some of the pieces and created history fair videos. We had people create songs and poems and festivals. We opened the lab. We opened any event we could. I sometimes feel like I've spent the last 15 years just talking. And we did get widespread attention. We did get that Network to Freedom designation. And by most importantly, for the history, we were able to get the city of Bradenton to fund large-scale excavations, which we did in January 2020, and the Division of Historical Resources from the state of Florida for the laboratory work that was finished in summer of 2021. As a scholar, I am just so grateful that an important heritage is now better known, that there's exhibits at Reflections of Manatee, as Sherry pointed out, that you all should visit. There's an exhibit at the Ringling Museum of Art at its community gallery, and up at the Florida Museum of History in Tallahassee. Angola is part of Spirits of Passage. But does it make an impact? That's our focus this evening. Is this material, this history, making a difference towards how we understand ourselves in the sweep of history, issues of race, and issues of social justice? And so with that, I turn it to our panelists to start sharing some of their thoughts, their experiences, and views. And we'll go in order that we have on the board. So Professor Armstrong can go first.
All right, thank you. How is this for sound? Am I good? Okay. I'd like to start off by thanking Manatee Public Library and our sponsors and our coordinators and our moderators and the fellow panelists for bringing this all together, and especially to those of you who came out tonight to have this conversation. So I was thinking about the topic from Angola to today, and as was mentioned in the introduction, my work focuses on historical memory, largely conceived around segregation and Jim Crow violence, civil rights movement, and how these things are represented in art and literature, and also how things are represented in public memorials and monuments. And one of the ways that I know my fellow panelist, Ms. Hubbard here, is from working with the Pinellas Remembers, which is a local affiliate of the Equal Justice Initiative, which is putting up historical markers for lynching all over the country. So we work together. High five, Jackie. We work together in downtown St. Petersburg to put up a historical marker. So from working with the Equal Justice Initiative, and I don't know if you're familiar with that organization, but They are in Montgomery, Alabama, and they do a lot of different things. If you probably have heard of Brian Stevenson, or you might have read his book, Just Mercy, or seen the feature film about him. But they started off working to get people who had been wrongfully convicted off of death row. And from there, they branched out into more educational efforts, because what they realized is that these were happening, and most of these wrongful convictions had a racial bias issue behind them, right? So one of the things that they noticed is that that there was a lack of education about the wider historical scope, especially regarding race. And so they wanted to do some specific educational efforts, with attorneys, with judges, with the citizenry who are the potential jury pools, to help people understand what they see and they describe is a long history of racial discrimination and oppression, stretching from slavery through segregation, and into current issues with mass incarceration, which disproportionately affects men of color, Black and brown men. So, this history is essentially the white supremacist playbook, right? And it's different forms of maintaining white supremacy that shift as one goes through different historical moments. I was talking about that with a colleague the other day. Poet Amiri Baraka refers to it as the changing same, right? So it's a very similar kind of playbook. A playbook of dehumanization, of disenfranchisement, of discrimination, 3 Ds, right? Well, conversely, there's also, in addition to those 3 Ds, there are also 3 Rs. There's resistance, rebellion, and running away. And people have ways of holding on to their dignity, holding on to their humanity, despite the most horrific situations. And so it's a twofold history that there's a lot of a misunderstanding about that history. There's a lot of erasure about that history, even before we had in across the country an outcry against teaching race in the classroom, or critical race theory, or things of that nature. There's been a resistance to what people in the civil rights educational field called hard history, right? Those difficult topics that are hard to talk about. But that history is often very literally hidden beneath our feet in places like Angola. I'm also involved in St. Petersburg, through USF. I'm also involved with the African American Burial Ground and Remembering Project, which is a multi-campus, multidisciplinary team that is looking at cemeteries that have been erased or paved over. For example, there's one in Tampa, which is the Zion Cemetery under the Robles Park Village Housing projects. There's some in in Clearwater, and also in St. Petersburg, where I'm from. There were 3 former largely African American burial grounds underneath Interstate 175 in Tropicana Fields, Lot 1, right? So supposedly there, the bodies, both Black and white burials, were exhumed and relocated, but ground-penetrating radar very recently discovered that that is actually not the case. There are bodies buried on those sites. So, what do we do? But, as I was saying, this history is very often literally beneath our feet or hiding in plain sight. And that's something that we learned when putting up the historical marker for the lynching in St. Petersburg. People drive past the site every day. They don't know that something historic happened here. People drive across Interstate 175, going to the Trop, going to downtown St. Pete every day. 40,000 people pass through that interstate, and they don't know that there's a literal historical story that is just right there. So there's a lot of erasure. There's a lot of absence of information. So I guess one of the things I've tried to do in my work is to think about the way that people remember, whether that's oral history or art or the myriad ways that people do try to remember that history. And then very often unofficial ways, but what can also be done in more official ways to remember, to memorialize, to commemorate, to talk honestly about that history. So I'm really glad that there's a conversation here tonight, which I think is a very important part of that process. There's a lot of resistance to the act of memorialization. And that happens for a couple of reasons. And number one, it is a difficult conversation. It's hard to bring people from different demographics together in a room like we are here to have honest conversations about a hard past. There are different stakeholder positions. There are people who were victims of violence. There are people who were perpetrators of violence. There are bystanders, and everyone has a different relationship to that history, and a different interest in preserving that history or erasing that history. And so there's a lot of different perspectives on should we remember? How should we remember? How should it be done? So it's very hard to bring those different stakeholder positions together many times. So it's important, I think, even though it's hard, to have those conversations, because what is the right thing to do is not necessarily the easy thing to do. Hidden history is hurtful history, I believe, because it forces us to live a lie, to live in ignorance, and rather than being open and honest about who we are as a community, as a city, as a state, as a nation. So we're not being honest about that. So these stories about places like Angola, about lynchings in St. Petersburg or Manatee County, these kinds of stories they're part of our shared history. They're part of our shared, no matter what stakeholder position we take, right? They're part of our shared communal history. And we have a choice. We have a choice between whether we want to be hurtful or healing, or whether we want to be on the wrong side of that history or the right side. So I'll stop there and wait for other questions, but that's my 2 cents. So
Thank you so much. Reverend Golden?
say again?
Reverend Golden?
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion. The Angola that perhaps the others want to talk about are the result of another Angola, and I want to talk about that. I did not come tonight to have a conversation. I came to have a discussion, which is much different. History cannot be burned, it cannot be buried, it cannot be banned. But the evidence of history can be subjected to all three. And what archaeology does, and what these eminent scholars here do, is they look for the evidence of history that has tried to be burned or buried or banned. And they are to be commended for the outstanding job that they have done in uncovering this piece of history here. We were excited personally, my wife and I. My wife is from the Bahamas and from St. Andrews Island, and her good friend here. They came tonight to cheer. Go ahead and clap now. So they came to cheer me on, because this that we are discussing is just a small example of a much larger problem that has been in existence in civilization for centuries. The issue of Angola is an issue because it arose in the context of slavery. And slavery did not begin here in the United States of America. It is one of three major trade developments that occurred over 3 or 4 centuries. There was an East African slave trade that traded to the east in India and amongst Muslims, and it was versus Muslims and Christians. There was an intra-Africa slave trade that was between tribes in Africa and between countries in Africa as a consequence of war. What makes our discussion tonight unique is that third arm of slavery, and that's the North Atlantic slave trade that was designed to do one thing: provide labor for the colonies that had come from Europe to make more money for the crown. Now, if I wanted to talk about, quote, American history, I would then go into 1776 and the War of 1812 and the War of 1865, but that's not why I want to come. We've heard a lot about those actions. What I want to talk about now, I wish I was smart enough to have said this. There was a guy named Ron Karenga. That was his Americanized name. His African name that he adopted was Molina Karenga. Now, you all may not know his name, but he is the man that invented Kwanzaa. And I know many of us are in here familiar with the celebration of Kwanzaa. This is what he said. The effect of the Atlantic slave trade in African captives. This is what he said. The morally monstrous destruction of human possibility involved redefining African humanity to the world, poisoning past, present, and future relations with others who only know through this stereotyping, and thus damaging the truly human relations among people of today. This constituted the destruction of culture, language, religion, and the human possibility of progress based on merit. The problem that we have here is that we are in this room talking about one part of this larger problem. And until we make the commitment to learn from the history and put that history in perspective, we will continue to gather in rooms like this under grants from the Florida Humanities Council with less than 100 people in the room. And I pray that when we leave out of here, that we leave out with a commitment that we'll have more of these kinds of meetings, and that we will have more people interested in recovering the history. And I need for you to understand, this is what were those magic words she said? The views as expressed by Reverend Golden are not the views that everybody might have. Whatever she said, I agree with that, because I don't believe that we have a history. There is no our history. And because we don't have an our history, we don't have an our future. Because we are not in our yet. We are now filled with my history in your history. Very easily distinguishable by the fact that all around the Angola in this community stands evidence of the progress that has been made in spite of the efforts to bury Angola in this community. We have skyscrapers, and we have paved streets, and we have commerce, and we have schools. We have all of those things in spite of the burying of the history of the people that were simply trying to be free. That's all. So I appreciate the progress that we've made. We've outlawed slavery in this country. We've outlawed segregation in this country. And because of the people who went on before us, we've made tremendous progress. But we still have not outlawed racism, because that's not a law. We still have not outlawed separation, because when we go out of here tonight and go back to our homes, we will go back into some very segregated living conditions. We will not outlaw separation. We will not outlaw racism until we come to grips with how we got here. And we can't sugarcoat that. We cannot just say because we've discovered the history that that is good. We've now got to learn from it. Real people were lynched. Real homes were ripped apart. Real hearts were broken when they had to leave Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina and come down here to try to escape, and they didn't make it, many of them. And so we've got to get real about what the purpose of history is. You can't burn it, you can't bury it, you can't ban it, but you can learn from it. You can live with it. And most of all, you can learn how to love through it. There's no other way. Hating one's history and hating the people who are a part of it does not get us where we want to go. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. President Hubbard.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here to join you this evening. One of the things that I have spent my last 10 years or so working on has been this notion of communication and remembrance. And I see our history, as I discover it more and more each day, to be a very fascinating subject, which I refuse, anyway, to allow anyone to stop me from learning about it. We have a rich history. We have a history of survival. And one of the things that moved me into getting involved in the Lynching Memorial Project in St. Petersburg, which is where I live, came about because of a particular person, and that person was Reverend Michael Curry. When Michael Curry became the first black head of the Episcopalian Church of America, it got my attention. You know, I was brought up Baptist on one side and Episcopalian on the other. And as I matured, I became more involved in the Episcopalian Church just because it didn't last as long. It was quiet. You know, I could meditate a little bit. You know, I would feel that I've done my duty to my God, and then I could go home and watch movies and relax. But in any event, Michael Curry touched me. And one of the things that touched me, which I hope will touch you, is the fact that He talked about love, and he talked about racial reconciliation. Just think about those two words, racial reconciliation. Now, I define racial reconciliation with this way. With knowledge of our history, we can hope for understanding. With understanding, we can seek acknowledgement of our failures and our successes. With acknowledgement and truth-telling, we can seek forgiveness. With forgiveness, we can seek racial reconciliation. The mission of our Community Remembrance Project Coalition, which we started working on back in 2017, was to bear witness to the legacy of racial terror epitomized by lynchings in America. And this truth-telling must never stop. Most people don't even realize that the Equal Justice Initiative recently updated their report on lynching in America, and they have now documented close to 6,500 lynchings, primarily in the South, the southern states, between the time of the end of Reconstruction through 1950. Now, the thing about America, which I find extremely interesting, and I have traveled quite a bit, is that America refuses to look at its history, both black people and white people. I have run into black people who have told me, oh, I don't want to hear about lynchings. And you say, why? Because it makes me so sad. And then you run into white people who say, well, I don't want to hear about lynchings. I wasn't alive when that happened. I had nothing to do with it. I don't want to feel guilty about it. My position is that it's not about making anyone feeling guilty. It's about the fact that you don't even know about it. So why don't you take a few minutes and look at the history? It's not a devastating history. It's a history that's very, very brutal, in which one group of people, based upon the color of their skin, and another group of people based upon a sort of privileged way of thinking, a European way of thinking is the way I put it, that they felt that they had the answers or the keys to the kingdom, that the only way to progress was their way, that the only civilizations that mattered were European civilizations. In fact, they didn't even care to learn about African civilizations, which had existed as long as there had been European civilizations. So in order to understand what happened in America, we have to confront this brutal racial history. We as black people need to know how brutal it was and recover from it. Whites need to discover how brutal it was and recover from it. Because without the knowledge of it, how can you ever be honest about it? How can you have a real conversation about things you know nothing about? How many people know that it's been estimated that at least 12 million Africans were brought over across the Atlantic during the slave trade, and that possibly 8 million more can be documented? So we're talking about a type of institution in which human beings were not given any value. They were only used to provide work. One interesting statistic that I just learned a few days ago from this book that I'm reading right now is that the average lifespan in the early part of American history for a slave was very short. I mean, 7, 8 years perhaps. Not generations of slaves on plantations that we have heard about. Short lives, lives that were brutally used to produce, to work, that had no value in any other way. In fact, when a slave worker could no longer produce, they had no value. And yet the entire country, in fact, one author argues the entire Western civilization as we know it, including not only North and South America, but also most of Europe, prospered on the backs of these millions of people who were enslaved against their will and made to produce things that had economic value. And there's not a single institution in this country that you can even think of that was not related to the institution of slavery in America. African slaves built this country, and they need to be acknowledged for what they contributed from their labor, from their imagination, from their gifts. And to think that we are still here surviving since 1619, it's an amazing story. And we deserve credit for surviving. And not only some of us survived, but many of us have flourished. And this is the part that I think these conversations should lead to. And I'd like to give you a couple of guiding principles and goals that we developed in our Community Remembrance Project Coalition. It took us 4 years to get that lynching memorial up. 4 dedicated years of research, work, convincing people to support it, and I'd like to share with you some of our goals. We wanted to advocate for the truth of the story. We wanted to educate with the truth of the story. We wanted to commemorate and collate this history in an effort to bring about reconciliation, justice, equity, peace, and healing. We had guiding principles. We believe that publicly confronting the devastating history of racial terror lynching in our own communities is an essential step toward recovery, healing, and racial reconciliation. We will not have a more just or humane society until we in America can reach the point of racial reconciliation. Neither of us are going anywhere. We're here. We also believe that deep traumatic and psychological wounds of racial terror lynching continue to impact the Black community. We believe that truth and reconciliation follow one another, and we are compelled to honestly and soberly recognize the pain of the past. In February of 2021, a lynching memorial marker was erected at the site of an actual lynching that took place in St. Petersburg, Florida. On November 12, 1914, a crowd of at least 1,500 people watched the lynching of Mr. John Evans, a Black man. Mr. Evans was accused, but never tried or convicted, of murdering a white Pinellas County resident and assaulting his wife. The crowd watched excitedly as Mr. Evans was hung from a light pole with a rope around his neck. Before his death, his body was riddled with bullet holes. He died hanging on that light pole. Mr. Parker Watson, also a black man, was lynched on May 9, 1926. His body was found on a county road near Clearwater, Florida. He had been forcibly removed from the custody of police officers by a group of armed, masked men as he was being transported to the county jail. His body was later found bearing 5 bullet holes and what appeared to be acid burns on his face. No one was ever arrested or charged in Mr. Watson's murder. We believe that additional lynchings in Pinellas County include at least 2 other deaths that were not completely researched by the time of the erection of the lynching memorial. Now, as I said before, this group of us who started this project included Drs. Julie Armstrong, Dr. Thomas Halleck, and other members of our little St. Augustine's Episcopalian Church, one of the oldest black Episcopalian churches in the state of Florida, founded early in the last century. We wanted to embody the teachings of Bishop Michael Curry. And in 2017, Bishop Curry called for racial reconciliation. ASALA, which is the organization for which I am one of the founders and the current president, we joined him in supporting this effort. Early on, this congregational group and ASALA met with Episcopalian leaders and the city of St. Petersburg's administration. In 2018, Brian Stevenson's The Equal Justice Initiative was contacted. This is after meeting for over a year with the church directly and the city. And I will say this about the city of St. Petersburg in the last administration. The vice mayor, Dr. Tomlin, when I walked into her office to discuss the possibility of the erection of a lynching memorial, she told me that this was dear to her heart. She's an African-American woman, and she was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and she promised to do everything she could to make sure it came to fruition. And she stood by her word, and she stood by us, and so did the city administration. We ultimately were given the land to erect the lynching memorial upon. The city worked with us closely, and the church worked with us closely, and we formed our Pinellas County Community Remembrance Project Coalition. It was founded in 2019. It was not until 2021 that we erected, February of 2021, we finally erected our lynching memorial monument, naming both John Evans and Parker Watson. Julie was very instrumental in drafting the language that you see on that memorial marker. And we had a very dedicated group of people, and we hung in there, and we got it done. When I was the co-chair of the Community Coalition, along with Ms. Gwendolyn Reese, who was my co-chair, and we both stayed a part of the coalition until the memorial was erected, at which time we both decided we would jointly retire from our co-chairmanship and take a break.
Amen.
And at the time that we left the coalition, the monument was up. The coalition had over 80 members. it was a success. And I think it will continue to generate conversations that will hopefully lead to racial reconciliation. We don't need to fight. No one gains anything from fighting. You may win one day and lose the next. And I'm saying this from my own experience, because when I was in my college years and afterwards, I was a very active member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I was so active that when I applied, and I don't really care, the powers that be know this now, that when I applied for security clearance in order to work for the Voice of America at the State Department, I didn't put it down that I had and was a member of SNCC. Because I felt that if I did, I wouldn't get this summer job, which I needed. And so I didn't put it down. But I cherished those years, and I cherished every single march I ever went on. I cherished every demonstration that I ever spoke out against the Vietnamese War. And I cherish knowing the people that I know that participated in that civil rights struggle. And it was a big group. And there were some wonderful people. And I see this struggle that we're doing today to be a direct descendant of past struggles. And just as we won, for a short time anyway, we'll win again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, they put me up here with a bunch of educational scholars, and I come from corporate background and very practical background. So I'm going to approach it a different way. My school, Visible Women Academy, so I'm one of the co-founders, exists. Its very existence is because of history, of the lack of education. Education was used as a tool to keep a constant lower class. And you well know the history that you could even be killed as a slave if they found out you learned how to read. They weren't being taught how to read. But that's carried on, you know, up to today. Still one of the most segregated institutions, two of them are church and schools. And I was around at the time they were starting busing. I was in Pittsburgh. And some of my friends went, as says I went on to Phillips Academy Andover, and there's history even there. But it was just moving them to white schools. It wasn't educating them any differently. It wasn't educating them about their history. So we were K through 5, all boys, elementary school. We started Visible Women Academy because of the crisis, and I call it humanitarian crisis, of education of black and brown boys in this country. And without that education, they can always keep you as a subclass. So what we teach our boys, first we teach them that they are descendants of kings and queens. And they have the same power and intellect that they had in you. And we're going to bring it out. We teach them one of the pillars of, we have 2 pillars for our education model at Visible Women Academy. One is academics excellence, and the other is character development. And each of them are equally important. And we call it SHINE, that's our motto, if you will, of our school: selflessness, honesty, integrity, niceness, and excellence. And we also do have a success principle every month that is taught by our Dean of Students, and it'll be on leadership, character, role models. And that's done every day. And trust me, the examples that we use for those, I would say 90% are people of color, and showing them the history. Or even something as simple as letting them know, hey, you think Michael Jordan was such a great star. In fact, we just did this a couple of weeks. We were talking about persistence and work ethic. But he used to shoot 341 shots after practice every day. That's work ethic that you have to get. But we also, in that, provide them other things in history. For example, I started, and they did a research on it. I asked the school or about students who invented the light bulb. Well, Thomas Edison. They got that. I said, well, who is Lewis Latimer? Don't know who that is. Well, actually, he's the one that invented the carbon filament that was able to make light bulbs commercial.
That's right.
They don't know that history, but we teach them that history. They know who Lewis Latimer is now. We teach them, and I say I use this from a practical standpoint, also, and not all related to school. But for example, our boys, at least our 5th grade, are going to meet with Andrew Young tomorrow at the Westin Hotel. And part of that is we had our 5th graders study everything they could about Andrew Young. And of course, involved Martin Luther King and everything else in the whole civil rights movement and the pillar that he was in that movement. So that we're giving them history. But also it's important that they see role models. Now, you gave my background, and yeah, that education and $3 to get you a cup of Starbucks coffee. However, I was just like the boys when I was growing up. I grew up in poverty. My father couldn't read and write. And they need to see that coming out of that, there's role models like me, but there's thousands or hundreds of thousands of Lewis Parkers out there. And Louise Parkers too. Parker too. So we teach them, that history. Or for example, we teach them, and we do this not in so much a subtle way. I mean, you do it kind of subtly. But you teach them about the Great Migration that Reverend Golden has talked about. Well, that was coming down here. I'm talking about the Great Migration to the north. We teach them that wasn't done to go to some land and make things and have a better life. That was done because they were running away from terrorism. And my father, I mentioned, had to grow up in Alabama, and in 1920s, they were on a farm. They had a bumper crop one year. In fact, my grandfather was able to buy a car. A white mob came and burned everything down. So he ended up in Pittsburgh. They sent them all away. But also from a practical, I throw things on people as well. I was talking to, I'm on the board of Brinks, and I won't say his name, but one of the members of the board is an avid golfer and knows all the history about golf. He goes to Scotland, he could tell you anything you want to know about golf. So I asked him, hey, do you know who Dr. George Grant is? Well, no. I said, in 1896, I think it was, he invented the golf tee. You can't have a wider sport than golf, except for Tiger. But he invented the golf tee.
Great.
And he was a dentist in Boston. He was the son of runaway slaves. But he felt that it was too messy, what they had to do with sand and such to raise it up, so that's why he invented the golf tee. And trust me, he's probably one of the ones putting those up when he was a kid. That's just like in pet peeves. They all learn that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. You had 4 million slaves in the South, majority picking cotton. And you're going to tell me some white man invented the cotton gin. I really don't believe that history. You have others that, now this is one that I kind of throw on people some as well. I was talking to a gynecologist friend of mine, white gynecologist friend of mine, and very wealthy. And I said to him, do you know who Dr. James Marion is? No. Well, actually, in 1846, he was known as the father of modern gynecology. In fact, invented the speculum. But they all know that he used to take teenage slave girls and dissect them alive with no anesthesia, because he felt that slaves, black people, could not feel pain. Now, I didn't say that to him to make him feel bad. I said that to him so next time you have a black patient or you see a black person, just think of the sacrifice that was made to make you rich. I said, why aren't they teaching that in medical school for gynecology? And then also things like, well, it's all this big hoopla there and don't take away my guns and Second Amendment and such. But they don't know that Patrick Henry, give me liberty, give me death, when he was governor of Virginia, wouldn't agree to sign an amendment to it unless they put in there they could carry guns, because you carry guns for honor or protecting your property. And he wanted to be able to carry guns because slaves were property. And so he wouldn't agree to it unless that was put in, they can carry it for that as well. But the real issue was, yes, there were 4 million black slaves, and they outnumbered white people. And because of the uprising in Haiti, they were afraid that slaves were going to uprising, so they all wanted to have guns to protect. Learn the history. And lastly, another history. Slavery was such a horrible institution. Horrible institution. But you know that when Hitler was coming to power, and he wanted to do the same things with Jews, so he had people come over here and study slavery, because how could America was looked at such a great country, but yet the horror of slavery, how did they do that? And to even show him, 1% we know, 1% rule, 1% black blood, you're black. He even said that was too cruel. He made it 6% for Jewish people. And so we can go on with that, but I even bring it from a practical standpoint, how people are hurting themselves. McKinsey did a report. Now, it's 2008, so it's a little dated, but it came out and said statistically with data, McKinsey does data, that if black students, black and Latino students, were on the same level of education as white students, that alone is worth 2 to 4% in GDP. And we talk about we can't get 1%. If you would, you're shooting yourselves in the foot, because there's economic values to that as well. So that's the things that I really try to use in education of these boys, so they can see that they're leaders. And we teach them to be leaders. We teach them to be good fathers, good husbands, good community people. And you can go, the bar is so low. I mean, if someone else says to me, hey, you're doing a great job, you're keeping them out of the system. Anyway, that bar is so low, and that's what they expect, the performance of that low bar. We set the bar way high, and that's what we expect, to hit that bar. And that's why character development is so important, because teach that aspect of it. Little Johnny or Jose, you may not get an A or B on your first test, but you can show honesty today. You can show niceness today. You can show selflessness today. Because they come to us thinking they have no power. The backgrounds and such, they have no power. but you have power control over some things. And that gets their head back and understand that how much we love them. And then that's, maybe I'll stop talking now, but statistically, what's that been able to do to the performance of our boys? So I was in with saying that the very existence, why VMA needs to exist, is history. Thanks.
Thank you all, and thanks for the big round of applause for them. Now, I'm the one that needs to have the disclaimer about don't hold them responsible for things that I might say. But thank you all. Because we are running so short of time and we promised that this was going to be a conversation tonight, if you all don't mind, I'm going to open it up to the floor first for these good people who have come out and may not have the opportunity, so fortunate as I do, to interact with all of you all. So do you mind if we open it up to the floor first? Okay. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did you check them all for tomatoes and? Just want to be careful, that's all.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Sharon Jefferson, and I'm an educator in Manatee County for over 20 years. So, Dr. Baram, I remember the newspapers and education. So I've been teaching American history all that time. And if you remember, many of us educators were involved with the project in making sure that our kids understood the history of the community of Angola. So I definitely appreciate that and appreciate all of you. Have a question. Ms. Hubbard was talking so much about, the great work that you all did with the community to try to convince the community and the city to put up the markers. And I think it's definitely important that we do remember. What I was curious about is when we talk about the social justice aspect of it, then so what happens after, as Reverend Golden put it, the uncovering of the truth? What happens after that with regards to social justice? We're still in a situation where we have mass incarceration, we have the school to prison pipeline. So where does this lead us after we have uncovered the truth, which is what we hope will bring in the conversations that will lead to 100% total emancipation for all people? So that's just my question. It is, and if anybody else, but because I know that you all, you actually, you were involved in helping to put up the markers, and I know we haven't done it here in Manatee. I think I heard it was in Sarasota, and so that's what I'm curious about as to, is that organization moves forward, what happens after? So what were the next steps with regards to social justice?
Well, let me just tell you this. The struggle for social justice. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. The struggle for social justice is unending. If it took 4 years for a small group of people to convince 80 other groups and citizens in St. Petersburg to support one lynching marker, you can imagine what the struggle is going to be to achieve social justice. But each time that you are successful in putting up something that is beneficial to your community, it's a step forward. To my understanding, a number of local groups have had candlelight vigils around the monument. Churches have met there. Civic organizations have come and had their little meetings at the monument. So it's become a place. Every time I drive down Martin Luther King Jr. Street, I look over there to see if it's still standing. And it reminds me of everything that we struggle for. And there's nothing that you can predict will happen as a result of that marker. The marker exists. It's there. If you have any doubt about the fact that these 2 lynchings actually occurred, then go up to that marker and read about it. The marker wasn't there to institute racial justice It was to institute a conversation that would lead to racial reconciliation among all people. And it's just a very tiny step forward. And I encourage everyone here to make a step forward towards social justice. And when you're given the opportunity to talk about race and racial reconciliation, take it and talk about it. Yeah, we have a lot of pain in America. We have a lot of denial going on right now. We have a lot of overt hatred occurring. And I looked at our marker about a month ago, and there were cracks in it. Now, we're getting a new marker, but the city ran right over there, and their engineers looked at it when I saw it. And within an hour, they had determined that they weren't sure if it was a structural problem or if it had been vandalized. But I can tell you that the cracks in our marker go all the way through the marker. If you stand on one side and look at the crack, there's several cracks. And you go on the other side, it's obvious that the cracks have gone directly through the marker. Now, EJI has not told us, that's the Equal Justice Initiative, whether or not this is a common occurrence. But it's common enough that they have promised, and they have promised me directly, that they will replace that marker. And we will have a new marker exactly the same as the one that's there now. And they will deliver it to us, and it will be erected again. So these tiny steps may not seem like much, but they are, and they're very important. And we need to support one another in making these steps. You cannot ignore your history. You can't say it's too painful to think about. You can't say you weren't there because you weren't even alive when the lynchings took place. You can't give up generational responsibility like that. And it's our responsibility as citizens of this nation, to acknowledge our past and our history and try and rise above it.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Jefferson, for that question. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So in seeing and our concern about trying to repress the teaching of history, and really for all, I'm of Cuban descent, and I was thrilled to learn about the ranchos, you know, of even Cuban presence that was here that I never knew about, you know. I always wonder what other, right now in WEDU you have Black History Month. I mean, there is plenty of material to learn. But with young people who are so impressed by media, right, and movies and social, I always think, what other methods could we impress upon them that could get them to learn this history, especially if it's, right, sort of whitewashed or sort of repressed in the schools? And it's very intricate too, right? Like, you really could dedicate books and books. I mean, there are books and books to learn, but how else could we incentivize the youth to learn about it, I'm thinking. And I'm thinking more of like the media, the media outlets, not the formal media outlets, like the social or the music or rappers or, you know, we're trying to say that world to try.
Okay.
Does that
Thank
make
you
sense?
for that question. I'm going to direct that to you, Mr. Parker, since you are dealing right now with young people.
I was trying to pass the mic.
And while that mic is getting passed, I can tell you how much it means to have this conversation from a media standpoint, that we talk about these things, because if we don't talk about them, we cannot learn. So when you mentioned the medical field, I thought you were going to talk about HeLa cells. And for those of you all who may have recently heard about Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman whose cells were taken, her cancer cells were taken and dissected, sent all over the world, and her cells are considered to be responsible for so many of the medicines that we have today. So in terms of teaching history, it's not just the negative, it's not just the how do we deal with the pain. Perhaps some of it is about the hope, the contributions that all people have in them. What we tell our children about, you can be anything you want to be. You can be the President of the United States. You can be a good neighbor. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Parker, to take that question from the audience, please.
Thanks. And also, I just heard a story today. A study had been done for 18 to 21-year-olds, and they said, how important, what's your number one goal or that you want to get to? Fame was number 1 or 2. So, but back to the point. We, for example, we had Dominic Sue speak to our 4th graders last year. Now, he has a 4-year degree from Nebraska. I mean, it's not Nebraska. God, I got his college wrong. But his 4-year degree in engineering, civil engineering. He has his own construction company in Portland, Oregon. And he has his career plan, obviously, in construction after football. But he made the point to tell these boys that, no, obviously your stats are so low that you can get into pro. But instill upon your boys, the education was the most important part. And he's probably one, not I want to say rare, but lower percentage to actually went through full year college and graduated with great degrees and such as well. So we show them examples like that. You could say it's from media, but also shows that the hard work that needs to be done. But the most important part, I still come back to role models. Because if students, if they feel that their history, you've done nothing for society. You're just a burden on society, and that's what you are. And if you can show practical role models of different things, it's not all athletes or fame and such that you're trying to go after. But I used to, I'm not bragging, but I spoke to students in Cleveland once. I said to them, okay, let me give you a real quick description of somebody that you got picked up in the morning with a limo, driven to a corporate jet, to a jet right, not corporate jet, but to a jet, private jet, right up to the runway, flew to a place, spoke, had some people, and then got back in a limo, went back to the corporate jet, and flew back home. So what type of person has that job? Let me get some answers. I said, that's what I did today to get here. These opportunities are there. And I say, if you set the bar high enough, which we do, and make them feel their worth, and give them those practical examples. They don't always have to look at the Michael Jordan. They can look, as I said, there's hundreds of thousands of, and this is a great, one of the other things we do, this is such a great community for this Manatee and Sarasota, because we have tons of black people, men and women, that retire here for very successful careers. So we use we call it Project Visible. We use them to help show them examples as well.
Thank you for that. Yes, please, just take your mic.
Thank you. I wanted to speak to the question as well. I don't know the answer exactly of how you incentivize, elementary school kids and middle school kids. That would be your department. But I do know that by the time they get to college, when I'm teaching some of these subjects, the constant refrain is, why didn't I learn this in school? And they're eager and they want to know, and they're angry that they haven't been taught. that kind of hard history. And there's plenty of info. It's not as if it's hidden. It's out there. And there are organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative they just have a raft of materials, ready for teachers and for people to find on their own. And another similar organization, Learning for Justice, which is offshoot of the Southern Poverty Law Center, has teaching toolkits for teachers. They have podcasts. They have so much material that real educational experts have put together that offer information for students who want to learn it and teachers who want to teach it.
Thank you. And ASALA is a wonderful resource for information, including for young people. So that's an opportunity also, and you can find them online. They have a lot of programming. So we have come to the, yes, go ahead, last
Okay,
comment.
I just
Tim.
want to speak to this. We talk about the great migration of Black people who left the South and went north. One aspect of that history that is often overlooked are the families that did not migrate north. And I came from one of those families. And I can tell you that one of the things I am most proud of is the fact that when my granddaughter graduates from college, she will be the 5th generation of college graduates in my family. My grandfather was a physician. He practiced medicine in Durham and Raleigh and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He went to medical school when his class had maybe 10 students in it. And at the end of Reconstruction, you should know that there were 16 Black medical schools in existence in the United States, most of which were in the South. At the end of Reconstruction, shortly thereafter, we were down to 4. Now we're at 4, I think we're at 4 again. But 16 existed during that little short window when Black people had an opportunity to take advantage of what this country could offer. Many did. And most of them that took advantage of it, not only, but a lot of people who took advantage of it were people who stayed right here in the South, just like my family. And I just want to say we often ignore the people who stayed here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can imagine, you've heard the story, so you can imagine what it took to stay here, the bravery of so many people.
Right.
So is this something that we need to do again? Well, thank you all for joining us. Reverend, I would be remiss if I didn't let you say the last word. I don't want to be in trouble with God.
I appreciate that. And first off, again, I thank you all for the opportunity to be here. I am a man of faith. And in the Hebrew Bible that I use to practice my faith from, there's a verse that says, "My people perish for the lack of knowledge." Mm-hmm. The concern that I have here tonight is that we who are here will do nothing with what we have heard. And so the knowledge that has been gained will not go forth from this room tonight. But make no mistake about it, the 12 million that were lost in the Middle Passage weren't lost for naught. Mm-hmm. And the slavery that we endured from 1619 until 1865 was just another step to bring us into this room tonight. So the question was, what can we do? I'm chairman of the school board here in this county. And I can tell you, there is nothing you can do to combat stupid. You You can,
Reverend, I think you've said it all. I think you've said it all. So-
you can combat ignorance with knowledge. And the spreading of that knowledge is not in the classroom, is not even at the home. It's one person caring enough about another person to say, this is the truth.
Thank you for that so much. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell the story is what we talk about.
That's
Tell
it.
the story.
Keep
Thank
telling.
you.
Okay, I have the mic back on for a couple of minutes, and I appreciate, again, you all coming out tonight. We have heard some very eloquent speakers, and I hear echoes of the same things in much of what they had to say. Dr. Armstrong said that we all have a shared history, whatever our stakeholder positions. Reverend Golden, I was very moved by what you said, that if we don't have an our history, we don't have an our future. Ms. Hubbard said that with knowledge of our history, we can hope for understanding. And Mr. Parker talked about how his boys need to know the history to know the role models. And yet so much of it is just not out there. My personal experience, my husband and I traveled across the country in a little camper. And with the realization of how history matters and what stories we tell, I have just been so struck about the names of everything from mountains to lakes to buildings to roads really take up the majority demographic of white men that explored and built and had the seats of power when those things were named or were built. And that historical markers, even though that they're just little bits of history on the side of the road, they do acknowledge a past. And Ms. Hubbard's talk about how the Equal Justice Initiative is putting up markers in bringing soil and acknowledging the past, that each one of those provides a small story and may provide a history for your boys to learn by acknowledging the people who we don't talk about. We certainly all learned about Thomas Edison and yet not about Mr. Latimer. And that every time we bring up those extra stories, they all enrich us. Each one of them enriches us all and provides an opportunity for us to think of how much more we don't know and how we have to have a more encompassing version of the history we tell. And that's really what this conversation was about, and that's really, I'll bring it back to locally with what we're trying to do with Reflections, is to tell those diverse stories. And I can only hope that going out from this, we can engage with each other, we can use our organization to be a safe place to discuss these multiple things, have more conversations like this, and try to make some partnerships within the community to enable these discussions, help you mentor your boys, maybe get some more markers put up, map out some of the other stories that are important to this community. Again, thank you to our moderators, thank you to each of our panelists. It's been a really important and meaningful evening, and thank you for participating.